In the frozen stillness of Plainfield, Wisconsin, one man's loneliness birthed a darkness so intimate it reshaped America's idea of evil. What began as grief in a farmhouse became a mirror held up to us, all proof that monsters are not found in shadows, but in the quiet places we choose not to look. The camera drifts slowly over a field swallowed by winter. Snow lies in thick, undisturbed layers across the flat expanse of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place so small it barely earns its name on a map. The horizon stretches endlessly, broken only by the black lines of fence posts and the silhouettes of leafless trees that seem to reach for a sky drained of color. The sound of wind cuts through the silence, carrying with it the faint creak of an old weather vane and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Then, the voice of the narrator enters measured, steady, and heavy with quiet dread. Asterisk. This was America's heartland. Asterisk, he says. Asterisk. Where everyone knew everyone. Or thought they did. Asterisk. The town, when it appears, looks almost painted in frost. A single street, lined with modest buildings, hardware store, gas pump, the church steeple standing stubbornly against the cold. The camera lingers on the faces of townsfolk from old photographs, men with heavy coats and quiet eyes, women in scarves and modest smiles. These were not city people. Their lives were measured in seasons, in harvests, in Sunday sermons. They trusted in the rhythm of small-town life, a rhythm that had not changed in decades. Beneath that stillness, something darker pulsed unnoticed. Plainfield was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where strangers were a rarity and gossip filled the space where fear should have lived. Yet behind one of those doors, on a farm just outside the town limits, a man lived who saw the world differently. His house was a museum of solitude, a place where silence spoke louder than any sermon. But for now, the town slept peacefully in its illusion of safety. The narrator's tone softens, turning almost wistful. Asterisk. It was a place built on hard work and harder winters. A place that believed evil belonged to distant cities, not to quiet fields and church picnics. But sometimes, evil grows best where it's least expected, hidden beneath the snow, waiting for the thaw. Asterisk. The shot widens. The Gein farm comes into view, a small, isolated cluster of decaying structures surrounded by acres of emptiness. Smoke no longer rises from the chimney. The barn door sways in the wind, hinges whining softly. There's no movement, no sound but the sigh of the cold air brushing across frozen ground. The narrator pauses for a beat, allowing the silence to stretch until it becomes oppressive. Asterisk. In November of 1957, asterisk, the voice continues, asterisk, that silence would be broken. And what was found beneath it would change America's idea of horror forever. Asterisk. The frame tightens on the Gein farmhouse dark windows, staring back like eyes that have seen too much. The music swells low and haunting, and the snow begins to fall again, erasing everything in white. The film shifts from the cold stillness of the Wisconsin fields to the faded warmth of sepia-toned photographs. A boy stands beside a stern woman in a long black dress, her hand gripping his shoulder not with affection but with ownership. The narrator's voice returns, calm but edged with unease. Asterisk. Edward Theodore Gein was born on the 27th of August, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He would spend most of his life no more than a few miles from where he was born, bound by blood, fear, and faith. Asterisk. A church hymn hums faintly under the narration, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," as old film reels flicker with images of small Midwestern towns, wooden crosses, and modest clapboard houses. The camera settles on a portrait of Augusta Gein, Ed's mother, her eyes cold and heavy with a kind of righteous fury. She was the axis around which his world revolved. To Augusta, the outside world was a pit of sin. Women were temptresses, men weak-willed, and pleasure itself an affront to God. She quoted scripture with the weight of law, her voice sharp enough to carve guilt into the air. His father, George Gein was her opposite, a man defeated by life and drink. Once a tanner, later a failed grocer, George drifted between jobs and bottles, his presence in the household more ghost than guardian. The townspeople remembered him slumped in the tavern, muttering about his wife's fire and his own worthlessness. He died before Ed reached manhood, leaving Augusta's dominion complete. The house became her chapel, and Ed her most devoted congregation. Neighbors would later recall seeing Augusta walking to church every Sunday, Ed trailing behind her like a shadow. He rarely spoke, rarely played with other children. While boys his age learned how to hunt or dance or court girls, Ed learned how to listen to sermons, to his mother's tirades about lust and eternal damnation. To her, salvation was isolation. She kept her sons away from women, away from laughter, away from life. Asterisk. He was raised in a house where sin was everywhere. Asterisk. The narrator intones. Asterisk. Except in his mother's eyes. Asterisk. The film lingers on a shot of the Gein farmhouse interior walls stripped bare, crucifixes hanging over every door, a Bible open on the table like a silent witness. The narrator continues, his tone softening but not forgiving. Asterisk. Ed's world ended where Augusta's began. When she spoke, he listened. When she prayed, he knelt. And when she warned that the world beyond their door was damned, he believed her. Asterisk. Outside, the Wisconsin landscape rolls on unchanged, vast, quiet, God-fearing. But within that farmhouse, a seed was being planted. Isolation took root, shame grew strong. And somewhere in the shadows of that boy's mind, a longing began to twist into something unspeakable. The camera glides low over the frozen landscape before rising to reveal the Gein farmstead, a small, sagging house crouched at the center of a vast, colorless plain. From above, it looks less like a home and more like a wound in the earth, the fields around it empty, lifeless, stripped of warmth. The narrator's voice is hushed, reverent in tone, as if speaking in a church. Asterisk. After Augusta's death in 1945, the farmhouse on Plainfield's edge became a tomb. What had once been ruled by her voice, her scripture, her judgment, was now filled only with silence, and Ed Gein learned to live inside it. Asterisk. The aerial shot fades to the interior of the house, dim and claustrophobic. Dust floats in the air like drifting ash. Every surface bears the evidence of neglect: newspapers stacked to the ceiling, broken chairs, a radio murmuring static in the background. The camera drifts down a narrow hallway, pausing at a closed door. The handle is tarnished but polished from use. This was Augusta's room, and Ed never let the world touch it again. The narrator continues, he sealed his mother's bedroom, preserving it like a shrine. Inside, nothing changed. The lace curtains still white, the bed neatly made, the Bible open to the book of Revelation. It was as though she might return at any moment. Downstairs, however, the rest of the house rotted in quiet decay. Ed lived mostly in the kitchen, the stove black with soot, the wallpaper peeling like skin. Rats scurried in the walls. He slept in a corner chair rather than in a bed, surrounded by scraps of newspapers and pulp magazines, many of them filled with tales of death, anatomy, and the occult. It was here, amid the detritus, that his mind began to bend inward, searching for the presence he had lost. Neighbors recalled seeing him about town, a shy man with an awkward smile and a childlike politeness. He ran odd jobs, repaired machinery, babysat children. They said he was harmless, just Ed. But when he returned to the farm each evening, the loneliness pressed in like a living thing. Without Augusta's voice to guide him, he began to create his own sermons, whispered into the empty rooms. He spoke to her photograph as though it could answer, asking forgiveness for thoughts he could not name. It was the silence that did it, the narrator murmurs. Asterisk. The kind of silence that erodes the edges of a man's mind until only echoes remain. Asterisk. The final shot returns to the farmhouse exterior, framed in twilight. One window still glows faintly from the flicker of a single oil lamp. Beyond that light is only darkness, and the faint suggestion of movement inside a solitary figure surrounded by the ghosts of memory, listening for a mother's voice that would never speak again. Snow drifts softly across the main street of Plainfield, the camera moving past the dimly lit windows of a tavern where laughter once mingled with the scent of beer and wood smoke. The narrator's voice cuts through the quiet, with the measured tone of a storyteller, retracing old wounds. Asterisk. For years, Plainfield had been a place untouched by crime. People left their doors unlocked, their keys in their cars. They knew their neighbors by name, their secrets by heart. But beneath that trust, something had begun to stir, something they refused to see. Asterisk. The scene shifts to ***, December 1954 ***, the night ***, Mary Hogan ***, vanished. Archival photos show her behind the counter of her tavern, a brassy woman with dark curls, known for her loud laugh and sharper tongue. She had run the tavern alone, the kind of woman Ed Gein had warned her son about. The camera pans across the empty bar stools, the half-finished drinks, and the single smudge of blood found behind the counter the next morning. No body, no witnesses, no explanation. Just a vanished woman and a small town eager to look away. A reenactment flickers to life in grainy black and white. A Plainfield deputy walking through the tavern, his boots crunching on broken glass. The narration quotes directly from the police report ***, blood on the floor, a spent cartridge near the counter. Possible struggle, victim presumed abducted. **, locals whispered theories robbery, jealous lover, maybe she'd just left town. But no one thought to look toward the lonely farmhouse on the edge of the frozen fields. **, this wasn't a city of strangers. **, the narrator reminds us. **, it was a town that trusted its own. **. 3 winters passed. Plainfield healed over like ice reforming on a broken pond. Then came ***, the 16th of November, 1957. ***. It was the first day of deer season, and hardware stores across Wisconsin were busy selling ammunition and supplies. Bernice Worden. **, 58, worked alone in her family's shop on Main Street. When her son, Deputy Frank Worden, stopped by that evening, the store was empty. The cash register was gone. A streak of blood led out the back door and into the snow. Police followed tire tracks that wound north along a frozen dirt road to the Gein property. They found the truck parked outside the barn. Inside, under the dim glow of a swinging bulb, they discovered what had become of Bernice Worden. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper, heavy with disbelief. **, what they found hanging there would redefine the boundaries of human horror. **. The chapter closes with silence, no music, no dialogue, just the sound of wind sweeping through the empty town, carrying with it the echo of 2 women's names that Plainfield would never forget. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. The morning of the 16th of November, 1957, began like any other in Plainfield, cold, gray, and still. The streets were quiet but for the hum of pickup trucks headed into the woods for the opening day of deer season. The Worden hardware store should have been bustling, its shelves lined with ammunition, lanterns, and winter supplies. Instead, the bell above the front door jingled into emptiness. A single overhead light flickered above the counter. The cash register sat open, its drawer pulled out like a mouth caught mid-scream. There was no sign of Bernice Worden. Her son, Deputy Frank Worden, arrived just before noon, expecting to see his mother's familiar smile behind the counter. Instead, he stepped into silence. His boots echoed on the linoleum floor, crunching faintly as he looked down. A dark smear of blood stretched from behind the counter, across the floor, and through the back doorway. The smell hit him next, metallic, faintly sweet, already cooling in the winter air. He called for backup, his voice trembling despite years of training. The scene that followed unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm of lawmen who knew something was terribly wrong but dared not yet name it. Sheriff's deputies photographed the trail, marked the scuffed footprints, and followed the crimson line that led through the snow. Outside, the world was bright and silent, the kind of morning where the cold seems to still time itself. But every few steps, the deputies found another splash of red against the white. It led them to a set of tire tracks, deep and fresh, heading north out of town. At the hardware counter, a single receipt sat pinned under a ledger. On it, in careful handwriting, was the name **** Ed Gein ****. He had been there the night before, buying antifreeze. Frank Worden stared at the receipt for a long moment before saying quietly, "That's him. That's Ed." The sheriff nodded once. Everyone in Plainfield knew Ed. Quiet, odd, polite. The kind of man who fixed neighbors' engines, watched their children, and never caused trouble. But the name on that receipt felt suddenly different, heavy with something unsaid. By dusk, the patrol cars had gathered near the edge of Gein's property. The house stood in shadow, the barn door swaying slightly in the wind. The men moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the dark. Each breath fogged the air. Somewhere in the distance, a hunting rifle cracked a reminder that the season had begun. But the next shot fired in Plainfield that day would not be for deer. It would be the sound of discovery, the moment the door swung open to reveal the nightmare waiting inside. The search party reached the Gein property just after sunset, the light fading to the color of ash. A cold wind rolled across the fields, cutting through layers of wool and leather, making even the most seasoned deputies shiver. Their boots crunched over frozen mud as flashlights swept across the dilapidated farmhouse and toward the looming shape of the barn. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging under the weight of years and snow. The hinges on the door moaned as Sheriff Schley pushed it open, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air that spilled out was thick with the smell of damp hay, rusted metal, and something else. Something wrong. Inside, the barn was lit by a single swinging bulb, its weak glow flickering as if in protest against what it illuminated. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by their movement. The deputies spread out, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the wooden walls. A few muttered to one another about the cold, about how strange it was for Gein to leave his property unlocked. Then someone gasped a sharp, involuntary sound that broke the silence. The camera would linger here in stillness, the light catching on a shape hanging from the rafters. Bernice Worden's body was suspended upside down by ropes attached to her ankles. Her torso had been split open from sternum to groin, her organs removed with a precision that didn't belong in a slaughterhouse, yet didn't seem entirely human either. She had been gutted like a deer, the ritual grotesquely domestic in its execution. For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to stop. The narrator's voice enters, soft and distant, as though speaking from a great depth. Asterisk. What they found next turned Plainfield from a dot on the map into a synonym for horror. Asterisk. The deputies stepped back, their faces pale and expressionless, trying to reconcile the quiet handyman they knew with the butchery before them. Sheriff Schley whispered a prayer under his breath, his hands trembling around the flashlight. One of the men turned and retched into the dirt. The camera follows their lights as they scan the barn, the hooks, the blood-stained table, the tools lined neatly on the wall. Everything was in its place, clean, deliberate. Beyond the hanging body, a door led toward the farmhouse. The sheriff hesitated, glancing back once at the pale form swaying gently in the draft. Then he motioned for the others to follow. Their footsteps echoed as they crossed the threshold. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly, falling over objects that would make even hardened men step backward. Behind them, the light in the barn flickered once more, and the rope creaked softly, as though the house itself were breathing. The farmhouse was darker than the night around it. When the sheriff and his deputies stepped through the warped front door, the beam of their flashlights trembled across a scene that seemed beyond human comprehension. The air was heavy, stale, carrying a scent both earthy and chemical like rot preserved in dust. What had once been a simple farmhouse was now a labyrinth of decay and madness. The floorboards groaned beneath their boots as they entered the kitchen, the walls closing in like a tomb. The first thing they noticed was the clutter. Newspapers stacked to the ceiling, tins of food long expired, broken radios, jars filled with an unidentifiable yellow fluid. But as the light shifted, something new emerged from the chaos objects that at first looked ordinary until the mind understood what the eyes were seeing. A chair upholstered in something too pale, too textured. A bowl carved from bone. On the table, a lampshade whose seams were unmistakably human. One deputy stopped breathing altogether when he lifted a small object from the counter. It was a mask, a face, real and dried, its lips stitched into a half-smile. More hung on the wall beside it, arranged like trophies in a hunter's den. The narrator's voice returns, quiet, stripped of emotion. Asterisk. In that house, everything had been remade in flesh. Every object was a relic of someone who had once lived. Asterisk? They moved from room to room, each discovery worse than the last. In a dusty box, they found a belt made of human nipples, polished smooth with use. In another drawer, a collection of fingernails tied neatly together with twine, a wastebasket stitched from skin. On a chair, what at first seemed like a soft cushion turned out to be a face stretched and tanned, its features distorted by time. One deputy stumbled into what passed for a bedroom. Against the wall stood a mannequin torso fitted with a woman's skinned bodysuit. The camera lingers here, no music, only the quiet hum of the winter wind pressing against the window panes. Asterisk. He had been building something. Asterisk, the narration continues. Asterisk. A second skin, perhaps a second life. A body that was not his, stitched from the remains of others. Asterisk. The flicker of flashbulbs breaks the stillness crime scene photographs capturing horror in stark black and white. Each image fades in and out, grainy and unreal. The mask, the chair, the heart in a saucepan on the stove. The house seems to whisper through the silence, the echo of years spent alone with memory and illusion. Outside, the deputies breathe hard into the cold, their faces pale with disbelief. One mutters that no hell could be worse than what lay inside that house. The narrator allows a long pause, the silence itself doing the speaking. Asterisk. In Plainfield, horror was not a thing from stories or films. It lived behind a door left unlocked. Asterisk. The farmhouse looms in the final shot, its windows dark and unblinking, as if the house itself were still alive, watching, remembering. The camera moves through the ruins of the Gein farmhouse, now silent and cordoned off. A faint light filters through the broken windows, revealing tools still scattered across the floor, their edges dulled with age. The air is thick with dust, the ghosts of what once happened here lingering like a stain that refuses to fade. The narrator's voice begins low, almost reflective. Asterisk. To understand what happened inside this house, one must understand not anger, but obsession. Ed Gein's crimes were not born of hatred. They were born of longing, the crime of a man who wanted to bring someone back. Asterisk. Photographs of Ed fill the screen, his downcast eyes, his gentle half-smile. He looks ordinary, harmless, the kind of man who might offer to fix your fence or shovel your driveway. But as forensic psychologists speak, their words reveal the fracture beneath that meek exterior. He was not driven by rage, they explain, but by an emptiness carved out by years of isolation and devotion to a woman who had made herself his god. Asterisk. Augusta wasn't simply his mother. Asterisk. One expert says over the faint hum of an organ hymn. Asterisk. She was his religion. Asterisk. The narration unfolds like a dissection. When Augusta died, Ed's world lost its center. The boundaries between life and death, sin and salvation, began to erode. He began to visit cemeteries at night, flashlight in hand, moving among the gravestones, as if they were doorways. He would dig with care, sometimes stopping before reaching the coffin, other times prying it open to retrieve what he thought he needed most, a piece of his mother, or something that reminded him of her. He didn't see corpses, he saw potential resurrection. The visuals cut to his workshop, a small room lined with tools, saws, knives, and tattered rags. The camera lingers on the table where he worked, the surfaces scarred by use. Asterisk, he believed. Asterisk, the narrator continues. Asterisk, that by crafting a woman's suit from the remains of others, he could become his mother, or at least, bring her close again. Asterisk, this was not a killer seeking victims, but a son trying to erase the finality of death. Every mask, every piece of preserved skin was part of his ritual, an attempt to reassemble love from what could no longer love him back. The tone shifts from horror to clinical calm. Experts describe dissociation, necrophilic fixation, and the delusion of transformation. One psychiatrist's voice echoes faintly. Asterisk. It wasn't rage. It was yearning twisted into madness. Asterisk. The final image is a reconstruction of the woman's suit, faceless, hanging in shadow. The camera does not linger on the grotesque details, it lingers on the emptiness where a heart should be. The narrator speaks one final line before the frame fades to black. Asterisk. Ed Gein did not want to destroy women. He wanted to wear their absence. Asterisk. The revelation came not with the noise of a confession but with the slow unraveling of the impossible. When investigators scoured the Gein property, they catalogued each grotesque artifact and assumed they were staring at the remains of countless murders. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the truth became. There were names, fragments of identity that did not match any list of the missing. The faces stitched into masks, the bones repurposed into ornaments. They belonged to people who had already been laid to rest. The question that haunted the deputies and coroners alike was simple and unbearable. How had he found them? The answer came from the cemeteries that surrounded Plainfield, those quiet fields of stone where the snow gathered gently over the past. Official records from the Plainfield Cemetery, the Hancock Lot, and a handful of rural churchyards began to show signs of disturbance, graves slightly sunken, soil unsettled. The grass above never quite growing back right. When questioned, Ed Gein didn't flinch. He spoke calmly, even politely, about his midnight trips, describing them with the same tone one might use to recall fixing a fence or mending a chair. He said he would wait until the moon was right. He would take his truck, a flashlight, a few simple tools. He dug quickly, efficiently, the frozen Wisconsin soil giving way under his practiced hands. Sometimes, he claimed, he went only part way down, enough to open the coffin and look inside. Other times, he brought pieces home, objects of reverence, he called them. Faces, organs, bones. To him, it wasn't desecration. It was communion. Asterisk. They were already gone. Asterisk, he told investigators. Asterisk. I just borrowed them for a while. Asterisk. The camera drifts over the old cemetery now, the ground uneven and scarred by time. Snow settles on tilted gravestones, and the faint sound of wind carries a suggestion of whispering. The narrator's tone is almost reverent. Asterisk. He returned to the dead not to mock them, but to seek them, to touch the memory of his mother through those who resembled her. Each grave he opened was a prayer, twisted but sincere. In police reports, the number of exhumations rises. 9 confirmed, several more suspected. The bodies of women between 30 and 50, resembling Augusta Gein in shape and build. It was not lust that guided him, but devotion, an attempt to reconstruct the impossible, to assemble life from decay. When the realization settled over Plainfield, the town fell silent. The people who had once shared their pews and grocery lines with Ed Gein understood now that most of his victims were not killed, they had already died. The horror was not in the taking of life, but in the violation of its end. The narrator pauses over the final image, a row of restored headstones, each one bearing a name reclaimed from his workshop. Asterisk. In Plainfield, the dead did not rest easy. Their peace was stolen, not by hatred, but by a man searching for the warmth of a mother buried long ago. Asterisk. Under the harsh light of the interrogation room, Ed Gein did not look like the monster the newspapers would later describe. He sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, his eyes downcast, his expression mild. When questioned, he answered softly, sometimes with a shy smile, as though the deputies were old neighbors stopping by for coffee. There was no rage, no denial, no attempt at deception. What unsettled investigators most was how utterly ordinary he seemed. It was as if the horrors found in his home were the work of another man, entirely someone he spoke of but did not claim to be. The psychiatric reports written in the weeks that followed described a patient of quiet intelligence, cooperative, even gentle. He was polite to nurses, compliant with doctors, and eager to be helpful. He rarely raised his voice. Yet when asked to recount what he had done, his tone never changed. He spoke of the dead not as victims but as companions. Asterisk. They weren't really gone. Asterisk, he said during one interview. Asterisk. You can talk to them if you know how to listen. Asterisk. One psychiatrist noted that Gein's affect remained consistently calm when describing events of extreme abnormality. In another report, a doctor observed that Gein seemed disconnected from moral comprehension, as though he did not grasp why others found his actions monstrous. He spoke instead of purpose, his mother's voice guiding him, the pull to make her proud again, to keep her near. He did not see death as a boundary, but as a veil thin enough to pierce. The film shows these transcripts in stark white text against a black background while the narrator reads them slowly, almost clinically. Asterisk. He exhibited no malice. Asterisk, the voice intones. Asterisk. Only longing. The crime of yearning twisted beyond recognition. Asterisk. The visuals move between photographs of Gein in custody and slow pans of his abandoned farmhouse, each shot filled with unbearable quiet. Experts appear on screen, their tones divided between pity and horror. Some describe him as the perfect case study of psychosis, a man trapped between delusion and devotion. Others reject the diagnosis, calling him evil in its purest, most unfeeling form. One voice cuts through the debate. Asterisk. Insanity explains the how. It does not excuse the what. Asterisk. Through it all, Gein remained compliant, even curious about the attention. When told his crimes had shocked the nation, he seemed puzzled. Asterisk. People make too much of things. Asterisk, he said softly, almost apologetically. The narrator allows a long pause before concluding. Asterisk. Perhaps that is what makes his story so disturbing. Not the brutality of his acts, but the serenity with which he carried them out. For Ed Gein, the line between sin and salvation had blurred long ago, leaving only the echo of a voice that told him he was never alone even among the dead. Asterisk. The courthouse in Watoma was small, its wooden benches filled beyond capacity on the morning Ed Gein appeared before the judge. Outside, a crowd pressed against the frosted windows, the air alive with the murmurs of outrage and morbid fascination. Plainfield had never known such attention. Reporters from Milwaukee, Chicago, even New York had come to witness the hearing of the man whose name now sent a tremor through the nation. Inside, the hush was absolute when Ed was led in thin, pale, almost delicate in demeanor, his wrists cuffed loosely in front of him. He looked neither defiant nor ashamed, only faintly curious, as if unsure what all the fuss was about. The prosecutor's voice trembled with anger as he described what had been found on the Gein farm, the mutilations, the exhumations, the grotesque souvenirs. The words felt too heavy for the room, too dark to belong in daylight. Women in the audience wept, men stared straight ahead, jaws clenched. When it was Ed's turn to speak, he did not defend himself. His answers were simple, direct, delivered with the same disarming calm that had unsettled investigators. Asterisk. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Asterisk, he said softly. Asterisk. Most of them were already dead. Asterisk. The defense presented the psychiatric evaluations pages of notes describing hallucinations, delusions, and a deep-seated psychosis rooted in grief and obsession. Doctors testified that Gein lived in a separate reality, one governed by the echo of his mother's voice and the ghosts of his own making. Asterisk. He lacks the capacity, asterisk, one physician stated, asterisk, to understand the moral weight of his actions. To him, these acts were not crimes, but rituals of devotion. Asterisk. The phrase hung in the air like a curse. When the judge delivered his decision, the silence was total. Ed Gein was declared legally insane, unfit for trial, and committed indefinitely to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He would never face a jury, never receive a formal sentence. The law had found him too lost to be punished. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted not in relief, but in disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously, and one local woman shouted into the winter wind, asterisk. How do you punish a man who doesn't know what he's done is wrong? Asterisk. The camera lingers on the empty courtroom after the crowd disperses, benches abandoned, the echo of footsteps fading. The narrator's voice returns, low and measured. Asterisk. Justice requires understanding. But in the case of Ed Gein, understanding was the cruelest sentence of all. Asterisk. Archival footage fades in Gein being escorted into the hospital, a faint smile on his face, waving politely to the camera. Behind the bars of the transport van, he looks almost peaceful, as though he were returning home. The narrator continues, asterisk. He would spend the rest of his life behind walls that did not frighten him. The voices that haunted him in freedom would follow him there. And in the quiet halls of the asylum, Ed Gein found what Plainfield never could silence without judgment. Asterisk. The fire started before dawn on a cold March morning in 1968. By the time the first neighbors noticed the orange glow rising over the frozen fields, the Gein farmhouse was already lost. Flames licked through the roof, consuming the dry timber with a furious hunger that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere accident. The house that had held so much darkness burned quickly, as if eager to erase itself. Sparks drifted into the pale Wisconsin sky, carried on the wind like the scattering of unholy ashes. When the volunteer fire department arrived, there was nothing to save. The walls had folded inward, collapsing in waves of smoke and ember. The men stood at a distance, their faces lit in a grim, flickering orange. None of them rushed forward with hoses or buckets. They simply watched, silent and unmoving, as the fire devoured every trace of what had stood there. Later, one of them would admit quietly, asterisk. No one wanted to stop it. That place needed to burn. Asterisk. At the hospital in Mendota, when Ed was told that his home had been destroyed, he blinked once and shrugged. Asterisk. Just as well. Asterisk, he said. Asterisk. That place was bad. Asterisk. His indifference chilled even those who had stopped expecting remorse from him. For the people of Plainfield, though, the fire was not an ending, it was a reckoning. Some called it divine justice, a cleansing sent by God to purge the land of its shame. Others whispered of more earthly motives, boys from town with gasoline cans and guilt in their hearts, or perhaps someone who had seen enough horror for a lifetime and decided to finish what the law could not. No one was ever charged, and no one truly wanted to know. When dawn broke, only the chimney remained standing, a blackened pillar surrounded by ashes. Reporters came and took photographs, their cameras capturing what the locals could not bear to look at directly. The farmhouse, once a magnet for curiosity and whispered tours, was gone. In its absence, Plainfield could breathe again, or at least pretend to. The narrator's voice carries over the slow pan of the ruins. Asterisk. The fire burned more than wood. It burned memory, fear, and the uneasy fascination that had settled over the town. What remained was denial, charred and silent. Asterisk. As the years passed, grass grew over the foundations, and the ashes were carried away by rain. The site became an empty field, indistinguishable from the rest of the farmland that surrounded it. Children would pass by on bicycles, told never to stop, never to look too long. And perhaps that was the point. The house that had once held the darkest secrets of Plainfield had finally given the town what it wanted most. Not justice, not closure, but forgetfulness. The wind moved softly through the tall grass now, whispering over what used to be walls and doors. Nothing remains but the memory of fire, and the relief that comes with pretending the nightmare was never real. By the time the ashes of the Gein farmhouse cooled, the legend had already begun. The newspapers had made him infamous, but it was Hollywood that turned him into something larger than life, a myth that would haunt American storytelling for decades. The details of his crimes, so unthinkable in their intimacy, became raw material for a new kind of horror, one that blurred the line between the monstrous and the human. In the years that followed, Ed Gein ceased to be merely a man. He became the template for the modern boogeyman. It began quietly, only 3 years after his arrest. Alfred Hitchcock released Time's Psycho Times in 1960, and audiences met Norman Bates, the soft-spoken motel keeper who lived under the shadow of his dead mother's voice. Though the film never named Ed Gein, the echoes were unmistakable. A lonely house on a hill. A son who could not let go. A shrine to the mother who had ruled his every thought. The world watched, horrified and enthralled, as fiction transformed real horror into art. For the first time, America saw that madness could wear the face of a neighbor, could hide behind politeness and a smile. Then came Times, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Times in 1974, a fever dream of violence and decay that drew its inspiration directly from Gein's House of Horrors. The leather masks, the furniture made of bone, the grotesque intimacy of cannibalism, all were born from the evidence catalogued in the Plainfield farmhouse. Yet the film's power came not from its gore but from its familiarity. A lonely, rural home, an ordinary family gone wrong. It was a reflection of a darker America, one that had begun to suspect its own innocence was long gone. By the time Times The Silence of the Lambs Times arrived in 1991, the Gein archetype had become a cultural shorthand, the lonely recluse obsessed with transformation, sewing together fragments of others to complete himself. The film's fictional killer, Buffalo Bill, was another ghost born from Plainfield's soil, proof that the fascination had not faded, only evolved. Each retelling distanced the world a little further from the truth, sanding down the raw horror into something consumable, cinematic, safe. The narrator's voice falls to a murmur over a montage of film clips and newspaper headlines. Asterisk. What began as tragedy became myth, and myth became entertainment. America could not look away, so it learned to watch instead. Asterisk. In the end, the Gein story became less about one man's madness and more about what his reflection revealed. He was no longer just Ed from Wisconsin. He was the embodiment of a collective fear that evil could live quietly next door, behind a smile and a locked door. The final shot fades from film reels to the snow-covered field where his house once stood, silent again. Asterisk. The real horror, asterisk, the narrator concludes, asterisk, is not that we made monsters of men like Ed Gein, it's that we found comfort in doing so. Asterisk. The years after Ed Gein's arrest transformed Plainfield into something it had never wanted to be, a place of pilgrimage. Long after the farmhouse burned to the ground, the curious still came. They drove for hours just to stand at the edge of the field, staring at nothing, taking photographs of the emptiness where horror once lived. Some came out of morbid fascination, others out of disbelief. They wanted proof that it had really happened here, in a place so ordinary it might have been their own hometown. Not long after Gein was declared insane, his possessions, those that had survived the investigation, became a strange kind of currency. the state held an auction in 1958 to sell what was left of the Gein estate. Cars lined the dirt roads for miles, and a carnival atmosphere descended upon the small town. People sold popcorn and hot dogs while bidders vied for pieces of his life: farm tools, furniture, the rusted truck that had once carried bodies from the graveyard. There were whispers that some buyers came from out of state, men who collected the relics of murder like others might collect stamps or coins. Reporters called it the Plainfield Ghoul Auction. To many locals, it felt like a second desecration. They remembered the victims, the families still haunted by what he had done, and could not understand how anyone could treat such horror as novelty. But for others, it was curiosity, an attempt to touch the edge of the unthinkable, to own a piece of evil and keep it safely behind glass. One man was overheard saying, asterisk, "It's not every day you get to buy a piece of history." Asterisk. The narrator's tone shifts to quiet reflection. Asterisk. "It is in our nature to stare at darkness." Asterisk, he says. Asterisk. "We tell ourselves it is to understand, to learn, but sometimes we look simply because we cannot help it." Asterisk. The camera glides past the few surviving objects, photographs, yellowed evidence tags, and finally an empty display case in a regional museum. Its plaque reads, asterisk, "Item removed by request." Asterisk. The glass reflects nothing but the camera's own lens. The shot holds there, long enough for the silence to feel heavy. Asterisk. Some horrors should remain buried. Asterisk. The narrator continues. Asterisk. But we dig them up again and again, not with shovels this time, but with fascination. We call it remembrance, we call it history. But often, it is hunger. Asterisk. Outside, the Wisconsin fields stretch endlessly beneath a pale winter sky. The ground where the farmhouse once stood is bare, but the shadow of what happened there lingers, invisible yet permanent. In the quiet, we see what the town could not forget, and what the world refused to let rest: the uneasy truth that the line between memorial and spectacle is thinner than we dare admit. In the wake of Ed Gein's crimes, the world remembered his name but forgot theirs. The headlines turned him into a legend, a symbol of madness, while the women whose lives he stole were reduced to footnotes in his mythology. Yet before the horror, they had been more than victims. They had lived, laughed, worked, and loved in the same quiet corners of Wisconsin that would later be defined by their disappearance. To tell their story now is to return what was taken, not their lives, but their dignity. Mary Hogan was the kind of woman who filled a room. She owned and ran a tavern on Plainfield's main road, a place where laughter came easily and the regulars knew her by name. Her accent carried traces of Chicago, sharp and lively, and her humor could turn even the darkest winter day warm. She was outspoken, sometimes brash, and for that, some of the townsfolk whispered about her behind closed doors. But others admired her independence. She was a woman who had carved a space for herself in a world that did not make it easy for women to stand alone. The night she vanished, the tavern went silent. Her absence was more than the loss of a neighbor, it was the dimming of something bright. Bernice Worden, by contrast, was Plainfield's steadiness. A widow and mother, she worked in her family's hardware store, keeping books, ordering supplies, and greeting customers with a polite smile that carried genuine warmth. She was patient, devout, and kind. People trusted her. Her son, Frank, remembered her as a woman of quiet strength, the kind who weathered grief without letting it harden her heart. The morning he found the blood trail in the snow, something in Plainfield cracked that would never fully mend. The narrator's voice softens over faded photographs. Mary behind the bar, smiling with a drink in hand. Bernice standing outside her shop, the sunlight caught in her hair. Asterisk. These were not symbols of horror, asterisk, he says. Asterisk. They were lives interrupted. They were women whose laughter once filled this town, whose hands built its rhythm. Asterisk. In returning to them, the story itself finds a measure of redemption. The camera drifts over their graves, the stones simple and clean against the Wisconsin earth. Flowers have been placed there, some fresh, some withered by the cold. Asterisk. Monsters steal attention. Asterisk. The narrator continues. Asterisk. But memory belongs to the innocent. Asterisk. The final image fades to black and white. The empty main street of Plainfield, quiet now, snow beginning to fall. Asterisk. In the end, asterisk, the voice concludes. Asterisk. The true measure of horror is not what a man can do in darkness, but what is lost when the light of ordinary lives is extinguished. Mary Hogan, Bernice Worden, remember their names, let the rest fade. Asterisk. The screen fills with faces, actors, filmmakers, writers, true crime enthusiasts, all confessing to the same fascination. Behind them, reels of crime footage flicker across the wall. Mugshots, police reports, news headlines, and the unmistakable face of Ed Gein, grainy and expressionless. The narrator's voice enters, not with judgment but with curiosity. Asterisk. Why do we look? Asterisk, he asks. Asterisk. Why do we return again and again to the stories of monsters, knowing full well the cost? Asterisk. Psychologists call it the times paradox of horror, times that strange pull toward what repels us. It is not simply morbid curiosity, but something deeper, older. The need to understand what we fear, to find a boundary between us and the darkness that might one day stare back. One criminologist on camera explains, asterisk, when we study the killer, we're trying to confirm that he's different from us. But the longer we look, the harder it becomes to believe that he truly is. Asterisk. The visuals move between archival footage of Plainfield and clips from the film's Gein-inspired Times, Psycho asterisk, asterisk, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre asterisk. Asterisk. Silence of the Lambs. Asterisk. Each one a mirror held up to the same question. When the audience gasps at Norman Bates, or hides their eyes from Leatherface, or leans forward to hear Hannibal Lecter whisper, what they're really doing is searching for a safe distance from their own capacity for darkness. We call it entertainment, but it's also confession. The narrator's tone becomes more intimate, almost conspiratorial. Asterisk. Every generation claims it studies killers to prevent them. But what we really do is turn them into icons. We give them stories, faces, names that outlive their victims. We build museums of the macabre, watch the documentaries, buy the books. We say it's about understanding, but understanding is never where we stop. Asterisk. In a slow montage, we see crowds at crime conventions, collectors showing off memorabilia, podcasts, and documentaries, dissecting each gruesome detail as if decoding scripture. The narrator continues, asterisk. We have turned the killer into a kind of folk tale. In the age of reason, he is our devil, our proof that evil still walks among us, wearing human skin. Asterisk. A psychologist adds softly, asterisk. It's control. We study them because we fear becoming them. Asterisk. Yet, as she speaks, the camera pans over a theater audience watching a dramatized Gein film. Their faces lit by the glow of the screen, rapt, horrified, entertained. The music fades to a low hum. The narrator returns for the final line, his voice calm but accusatory. Asterisk. We stare into the abyss not because we wish to fall in, but because we need to know the edge is still there. We make monsters out of men like Ed Gein to remind ourselves we are not them. But perhaps what frightens us most is how easily we understand them. Asterisk. The film returns to Plainfield, but decades have passed. The snow still falls the same way, soft and silent, covering the scars of the earth like a shroud. Drone shots sweep across the endless Wisconsin fields, flat, white, and still. The town itself has grown smaller, the years peeling away at its edges. What remains is a place suspended between memory and denial. The camera glides over the old cemetery, where the gravestones tilt like weary witnesses, and then over the patch of land where the Gein farmhouse once stood. There is nothing there now but grass and wind, yet the air feels heavier, as if something unseen still lingers beneath it. The narrator's voice breaks the stillness. Asterisk. Time should have healed Plainfield, but it hasn't. Because what happened here isn't just history, it's a scar. Asterisk. The locals, when approached, speak carefully, their words trimmed of names. They don't say times, Gein times anymore. They call it times the thing that happened, asterisk, or times the story, asterisk. A woman in her 70s shakes her head at the mention of it. Asterisk. There's no reason to stir that up again. Asterisk, she says, eyes fixed on the frozen road. A younger man, born long after the farmhouse burned, admits he still drives the long way around the old property. Asterisk. You can feel it out there. Asterisk, he says quietly. Asterisk. Even with nothing left, you feel it. Asterisk. Storefronts have changed hands. The hardware store long gone. The tavern where Mary Hogan once poured drinks is now a small diner with lace curtains and fresh paint, but in the back, an old mirror remains, its glass faintly warped, catching faces in a way that seems to stretch them. The people who stay in Plainfield have learned to live with the silence, to treat it as part of the landscape. Outsiders come from time to time, journalists, filmmakers, thrill seekers, and the town braces itself, answering politely, then locking its doors early. The film lingers on a wide shot of the town square at dusk. The Christmas lights flicker dimly against the snow, but there are no children playing, no laughter spilling from the shops. Only the wind and the creak of an old sign swinging above the empty street. Asterisk. The past never left Plainfield. Asterisk, the narrator says. Asterisk. It just learned to hide in plain sight. Asterisk. As the drone rises higher, the town disappears into a wash of gray fields and forest. The roads wind outward like veins, thin and endless. Asterisk. Every small town keeps its secrets. Asterisk, the voice continues. Asterisk. But Plainfield's secret was too loud to bury. So they buried the name instead. Asterisk. The final shot holds on the horizon, snow stretching to infinity, light fading fast. In that silence, the weight of the story remains, not as legend, not as history, but as something simpler and sadder. The shadow that a single man left on an entire place, long after both had vanished from the map. The film transitions to the gray walls of Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin. The tone shifts from horror to melancholy as the camera pans down the long, sterile corridors where time seems to move differently. Archival audio crackles faintly under the hum of fluorescent lights. Nurses and orderlies, their faces lined with memory, speak of Ed Gein not as the monster who haunted headlines, but as a quiet man who watered plants, read Western magazines, and smiled politely when addressed. One of them says softly, asterisk. He was no trouble at all. You'd never know what he'd done if you hadn't read the papers. Asterisk. The narrator's voice enters like an echo, asterisk. The world outside remembered Ed Gein as the face of madness, the man who turned grief into desecration. But behind these walls, he was just another patient, another forgotten soul among hundreds. Oh, the archival footage shows Gein in his later years older, thinner, his face almost grandfatherly. He tends a small patch of flowers in the hospital courtyard, hands working methodically in the soil. The same hands that once unearthed graves now nurture life. A doctor's voice overlays the image, asterisk. He responded well to routine. He liked order, quiet. He would clip magazine pictures, listen to the radio, sometimes hum hymns. The delusions never left completely, but the violence was gone. It was as though the storm had passed and left only the shell of a man behind. Asterisk? Staff describe how he would spend hours reading pulp adventure stories and comic books, his eyes lighting up at tales of explorers and distant worlds. He spoke rarely of the past and never of his mother, though her presence lingered in every quiet gesture, the way he avoided confrontation, the way he said grace before every meal. One nurse recalls asking him once if he was lonely. He had smiled faintly and said, asterisk, "No, I have plenty of company in my thoughts." Asterisk. The camera lingers on a close-up of his room, a neatly made bed, a Bible on the table, a small collection of gardening tools hanging on the wall. The narrator pauses before continuing, asterisk. In the end, Ed Gein's world became small again. The monster faded, leaving only the man, and that might be the most unsettling truth of all. The darkness that terrified a nation had never looked like evil. It had looked like this, quiet, polite, unremarkable. Asterisk. Outside, the Wisconsin landscape rolls on, unchanged. Snow covers the hospital grounds, softening everything it touches. Inside, Ed Gein ages into obscurity, his story reduced to whispers and case files. The narrator's final words settle like dust over the closing shot of the empty ward. Monsters die in stories. Men, however, simply fade away. Ed Gein died quietly on the 26th of July 1984 in the geriatric ward of Mendota Mental Health Institute. There were no crowds, no reporters waiting outside, no sense of climax or justice, only the steady rhythm of hospital machinery and the whisper of orderlies going about their work. He was 77 years old. After nearly 3 decades behind walls, the man who once terrified the nation slipped away without ceremony. The doctors listed his cause of death as respiratory failure due to cancer. For a man who had lived surrounded by decay, the end was almost gentle. His body was returned to Plainfield for burial, the same place that had tried so hard to forget him. Few attended the graveside service. There were no family members left to mourn him, only a handful of hospital staff and a local funeral director who had been paid quietly to oversee the arrangements. The casket was simple pine, unadorned, lowered into the frozen earth beside his mother, Augusta. Even in death, he remained tethered to her, the same haunting closeness that had shaped every moment of his life. The narrator's voice is low, almost reverent. Asterisk. For all his crimes, he asked for only one thing: to be buried next to his mother. And the state, perhaps out of pity or exhaustion, granted his wish. Asterisk. The camera lingers on the snow-covered cemetery, wind whispering through the pines. For a time, the grave was marked by a small gray stone etched with a name and 2 dates. People came from far away to see it. They left trinkets, letters, coins, sometimes bits of bone-colored stone chipped from the marker itself. It didn't take long for fascination to turn to desecration. The headstone was vandalized again and again, carved with graffiti, shot at, broken apart by souvenir hunters who wanted a piece of infamy to take home. By the late 1990s, the stone had vanished entirely, stolen under cover of darkness. It surfaced once in Seattle, recovered by police, then was hidden away for good. The cemetery caretakers decided not to replace it. Now, the grave lies unmarked, a hollow space between 2 older stones. Visitors still come, guided by memory and rumor, tracing the dirt where the marker once stood. The camera moves in close on the empty patch of ground beneath the moonlight. A shadow of a cross falls across the snow. The narrator's final words echo through the still air. Asterisk. Even in death, he could not rest. The body returned to the earth, the name to legend, but the story, like the scar it left, endures. And perhaps that is the truest punishment of all. Asterisk. The camera fades from the empty grave to a reflection, a pane of glass catching the filmmaker's face for a brief, unguarded moment. The narration begins, softer now, no longer distant or clinical, but almost confessional. Asterisk. Ed Gein's horror was not born in the dark, asterisk, the voice says. Asterisk. It was born in the human need for love twisted by isolation, silence, and obsession. Asterisk. The final chapter no longer feels like a story about one man. It feels like a reckoning. The film drifts through fragments of modern America, neat suburban streets, Rows of identical houses, the quiet hum of lawnmowers, families gathering for dinner under soft kitchen light. Everything looks safe, ordinary, just as Plainfield once did. The voice continues, layered over the imagery. Asterisk. We like to think monsters live far from us, that they are created in distant, broken worlds. But the truth is simpler and harder to bear. The seeds of horror grow best in the soil of loneliness, watered by neglect and hidden by routine. Asterisk. The montage slows. A mother kisses her son goodnight. A man closes his garage door. A teenage girl scrolls through headlines about true crime, her reflection caught faintly in the black screen of her phone. These moments, harmless on their own, echo the same small-town stillness that once sheltered Ed Gein. The narrator does not accuse, he observes. Asterisk Plainfield was not cursed. Asterisk, he says. Asterisk. It was ordinary, and perhaps that is why it frightens us most, because we see pieces of it everywhere we go. Asterisk. Archival clips return briefly black and white photographs of Gein as a boy, standing beside his mother. His face is open, uncertain, almost innocent. For a fleeting second, he looks like any other child from the 1920 seconds Midwest. Clean shirt, neatly parted hair, a hint of shyness. The narrator's tone softens. Asterisk. He began like all of us do, in need of love, of belonging. But when that love became control, when isolation replaced connection, it didn't destroy him, it distorted him. Asterisk. The camera moves through empty school halls, across empty fields, over doorways closed tight against the night. The voice continues. Asterisk. What we fear in Ed Gein is not the gore, not the graveyard, not the skin and bone. What we fear is that his descent began where ours might within the human heart, craving something it cannot have. Asterisk. The final montage fades between two images. The Gein farmhouse, long gone, and a modern suburban home, identical in its stillness. The same snow falls, the same silence holds. The music dwindles to a single sustained note. The narrator's last words are quiet but absolute. Asterisk. Monsters do not come from nowhere, they come from us. Asterisk. The screen fades to black. Only the sound of wind remains, low and endless, carrying with it the uneasy truth that the line between horror and humanity is thinner and closer than anyone dares to admit.